A Promise in the Shadows Part 4, Love and Terror. The sun sank low over the city, its feeble rays struggling to break through the heavy gray clouds. The streets were slick with frost, glistening in the dim light. The city was alive with the sound of distant wheels clattering over cobblestones and the muffled laughter of revelers spilling from warm taverns. Thaddeus Gerard adjusted the small parcel under his arm as he made his final delivery of the day. His breath formed pale clouds in the crisp December air, and the gas lamps lining the streets flickered faintly in the encroaching twilight. This delivery was special. It would take him close to Sanders and Company, where Olivia worked. The thought of seeing her again made his heart quicken. Though their conversations had been little more than polite exchanges, there was a warmth in her voice, a brightness in her smile, that had captivated him. She didn't know it yet, but tonight he would gather the courage to speak his mind and ask to walk her home. After dropping off his bundle at a nearby dry goods store, Thaddeus lingered in the shadows across the street from Sanders and Company. Through the frosted glass panes he could see Olivia moving with graceful purpose, silhouetted by the soft glow of the shop's interior. She reached up to place bolts of fabric on a high shelf, her golden hair catching the light like a halo. Thaddeus felt a tug in his chest. She was radiant, her every movement imbued with a quiet confidence he found mesmerizing. Thaddeus stood there, transfixed, his heart swelling with a foolish, youthful affection. Summoning his courage, he cleared his throat and crossed the street. The bell above the shop door jingled cheerfully as he stepped inside, his boots tracking faint traces of snow onto the polished wooden floor. Olivia looked up from her work, her emerald eyes locking onto his. "Good evening, Mr. Gerard," she said with a smile, smoothing her apron. "A late delivery, is it?" Thaddeus fumbled for words, his voice catching. "No, not a delivery." Olivia tilted her head, a teasing glint in her eyes. "Oh? Have you come to order a dress, then?" Her laughter was soft, musical, and it only made him stammer more. No, I don't want a dress," he stuttered, his cheeks burning as he caught the amused giggles of the other girls in the shop. Olivia's smile faltered slightly as she noticed his nervousness. The laughter from her co-workers seemed to spark a realization, and her cheeks flushed a delicate pink. For a moment she avoided his gaze, folding and refolding a small piece of fabric in her hands. Thaddeus, emboldened by frustration with the giggling girls, blurted, "I'd like to walk you home." Olivia froze, her blush deepening. You would?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Thaddeus said firmly, though his hands trembled. "If you'll let me." After a moment's hesitation, Olivia nodded, her voice shy and quieter than she intended as she replied, "All right." Thaddeus waited by the door as she finished tidying the shop, stealing glances at her while she worked. When she was ready, he helped her into her coat, their fingers brushing for a fleeting moment. They stepped out into the night together, their breaths mingling in the cold air as they spoke awkwardly about the weather and the coming holidays. As they walked, the warmth of their burgeoning connection wrapped around them, defying the winter chill. But the peace was short-lived. As they passed a narrow alley, shadows shifted. Before they could react, two burly men lunged from the darkness, dragging them into the cold, grim depths. Olivia's heart seized as rough hands clamped down on her arms. The world around her dissolved into a chaotic blur, but her mind was trapped in another moment, a memory she had tried desperately to bury. She was back in the warehouse. Cruel laughter echoed in her ears. She could smell the damp rot and musk of the tunnel, hear the heavy boots of men around her. "Olivia!" Thaddeus's voice shattered the memory like a stone through glass. She blinked and found herself being hauled deeper into the alley. Thaddeus was flailing wildly against his captor, his shouts echoing off the brick walls. Olivia's heart pounded. This wasn't then. Her trembling hands slipped into her bag, finding the smooth hilt of the blade Garwood had insisted she carry. Her mind cleared, her fear sharpening into resolve. The man holding her didn't notice her movements until it was too late. With a wild cry, Olivia plunged the blade into his side. He roared in pain, dropping her to clutch at the wound. She didn't stop. Like a cornered animal, she lashed out again and again, the blade sinking into flesh until his gurgled screams ceased. Warm blood soaked her hands, the metallic scent filling her nose as the man crumpled to the ground. Thaddeus, wide-eyed, watched in stunned silence as Olivia stood over her attacker, her shoulders heaving, the blade glinting red in the dim light. Who was this girl? Before he could process what he'd seen, his own captor released him, shoving him to the ground with a grunt. Thaddeus scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting frantically for a weapon. Spotting a loose piece of gutter tile, he seized it just as the remaining attacker lunged for Olivia. The man's thick coat absorbed her desperate stabs as his massive hands closed around her throat. Olivia clawed at his grip, her vision narrowing as she struggled for air. She cursed herself for not carrying the revolver Garwood had offered. A sickening crunch split the air as Thaddeus brought the tile down on the man's skull with all his might. The attacker staggered, releasing Olivia before collapsing in a heap. "Come on," Olivia gasped, grabbing Thaddeus's hand. Together they fled into the night, their footsteps echoing through the empty streets. "Shouldn't we go to the police?" Thaddeus asked breathlessly as they ran. "No time," Olivia replied sharply, her eyes scanning their surroundings. "But who were they? What do they want? And why do you have a knife?" "Not now, Thaddeus," she snapped, her voice trembling. His mind swirled with questions, but he bit them back, letting her guide him through the labyrinthine streets. Finally, they arrived at a modest house, the front door ajar. Olivia froze. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking as she pushed through the door. Inside, the scene was horrific. Her parents lay lifeless on the floor, their bodies battered and throats slit. Blood smeared the walls, and above them, in jagged letters, was the message, "You were warned." Olivia crumpled to the floor, clutching her parents' hands as her anguished cries cut through the stillness. Thaddeus stood frozen, the gruesome scene searing itself into his mind, the sight turning his stomach. He didn't understand any of it, but he knew one thing: they couldn't stay. In a burst of resolve, he scooped her into his arms. "We have to go," he said firmly. Olivia clung to him, her voice barely a whisper. 867 North 6th Street, number 202. "What? Garwood," she said, her voice steely despite her tears. "He's the only one who can help us." Thaddeus's mind reeled, but he didn't argue. Guided by the address Olivia had given, he carried her through the cold, empty streets. His arms burned with the effort, but he refused to let go. Her sobs had quieted to a fragile silence, and he couldn't tell if it was exhaustion or grief that had taken hold. The apartment building loomed ahead, its facade weathered and shadowed by the faint glow of a single street lamp. A disused and rotten staircase clung to the exterior of the building, like a dead and withered vine. A shadow of a bygone age, and speaking to the decay and rot that held the city in its grasp. Thaddeus set Olivia gently on her feet as they approached, keeping hold of her hand. Her trembling fingers tightened around his, as though afraid she might vanish if they broke contact. Inside, the stairwell smelled of damp stone and rusted metal. Their footsteps echoed hollowly as they ascended, each step feeling heavier than the last. When they reached the second floor, Thaddeus saw the door to room 202 slightly ajar. "Stay behind me," he whispered, though he didn't know what he'd do if danger awaited. Olivia froze in her tracks as the door swung fully open, revealing a grim tableau. 4 men stood over the slumped body of a broad-shouldered man, his dark hair matted with blood. They were dragging him out of the room, their boots scuffing against the wooden floor. "Garwood!" Olivia's voice rang out sharp and desperate. The men turned in unison, their expressions morphing from shock to malice. One of them sneered, pulling a knife from his coat. "Run!" Olivia hissed, grabbing Thaddeus's arm. They turned to flee, but the sound of heavy footsteps stopped them cold. At the end of the hall stood another man, his frame massive and imposing. He leaned casually on a long-handled hammer, the metal head gleaming ominously in the dim light. A sadistic grin spread across his face as he blocked their escape. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. Recognition flooded her. This was one of the men who had stood beside Carlucci that night on the river, the men whose presence had haunted her nightmares. She swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had been foolish to think she could escape the past. It had been a fragile hope, shattered now by the reality looming before her, "Thaddeus," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "When I say run, you run. Don't look back." "What? No," protested, his grip tightening on her hand. The hammer-wielding man took a step forward, his grin widening as though savoring the fear radiating from his prey. Behind Olivia, the 4 men from room 202 moved slowly into the hall, spreading out to trap them. "You think you're brave, huh?" the man with the hammer said, his voice a low growl. "You should have stayed scared, girl. Should have stayed gone." Thaddeus's throat was dry. "Olivia, run," she shouted, lunging toward the hammer-wielding man. Her sudden movement caught Thaddeus off guard. She ducked low, darting toward the wall. Thaddeus, overcome by a resolve he would never have guessed he possessed, flung himself against the hammer-wielding man as Olivia slipped by, pressing herself against the wall. The impact of the young man's body had almost no effect on the burly mob enforcer, but it did catch him off guard enough to allow Olivia to slip by beyond his grasp. Olivia twisted around and slashed at the hammer-wielder's leg, her blade cutting through fabric and flesh. He roared in pain, his hammer dropping to the floor with a metallic clang. Thaddeus was knocked to the ground as the bigger man instinctively recoiled against the bite of the blade. She didn't wait for him to recover, kicking the weapon further down the hall. Thaddeus regained his feet and sprinted toward the staircase, his lungs burning. Olivia also turned, making a break for the stairs. Thaddeus glanced over his shoulder to see 2 of the men closing in, their heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. Panic clawed at his mind, but he forced himself to focus. Ahead, the stairwell loomed. The hammer-wielding man staggered back to his feet, clutching his wounded leg. At the head of the stairs, Olivia turned back. "Garwood!" she screamed, her voice echoing down the hall. Thaddeus almost shoved her down the first flight of stairs as she continued to look back, tears forming in the corners of her eyes and running silently down her cheeks. Thaddeus and Olivia were both young and nimble. Their pursuers had just reached the head of the stairs as the 2 turned at the first landing. Looking down the stairs, they stopped, as if jerked back by an unseen cable. Starting up the stairs from the ground floor were 2 more men looking up as they ran, revolvers in hand. Time seemed to stand still as Olivia and Thaddeus locked eyes. They were trapped, the thunder of boots from above and that panting breaths of the men climbing from below closing like the jaws of a vice. No escape, no path of egress, no way out. Olivia silently mouthed, "I'm sorry."